Welcome back to It's Hard to Talk About It. My name is Yael Bat-Shimon. I just wanted to thank you first for tuning in again. I know that some of you have been watching, listening to episodes, and I really appreciate your comments. The more feedback I get from you, the more interaction, the more I can sort of be in conversation with you. And that's really what I want, is to be in conversation with you as much as possible. To hear how you relate to what I'm speaking about, any questions you might have, any things that you've been wondering about. I find that I'm always wondering about some aspect of whiteness and white supremacy and systemic racism. It's hard not to really, at this time in our country's history, it's just front and center all the time. Which is horrible, and also, uh, again, such an opportunity because you can't really turn away. I should say, I can't really turn away from it. And, no matter how much I have that impulse to turn away, because it's uncomfortable, it's painful. So I talked last week about white racial socialization. I talked a lot about my own socialization as a white person, how I learned um, to be white, what that meant, how I learned not to talk about race, even though I noticed it, how that influenced my relationship with interactions with people of color, particularly Black folks, how that influenced how I see myself, and how I see the world and my place in it, the things I've taken for granted, the privileges that I didn't know I had. So now I want to go back again. I talked in the second episode about the history of whiteness. So I talked about that moment. There was really more of a moment. It was a combination of things, but in the late 1600s to early 1700s, how white and Black came into existence together. So white does not exist without Black. Black does not exist without white. We are intimately intertwined. There is no segregation without white and Black. There is no Jim Crow without white and Black. There's no slavery without white and Black. Our histories are intimately connected, all the way through today. So, I hear a lot of people say, and I have been one of these people, said, oh, wait a second. My ancestors didn't own slaves. My well-being is not because of wealth that I was built by my ancestors or families on the backs of slave labor. And I want to address that by looking at my own history. Many of us did not come here until, I'm just going to speak about my own family. We came on both sides of my family. We came, I believe, in the 1800s, late 1800s. And I want to talk about what happened then. It's a lot of it's my imagination because I don't have a lot of actual information about my great-grandparents and grandparents. It was really my great-grandparents. And so some of it I'm making some assumptions and making some guesses based on what was happening and those particular ethnic groups at that time, why they came to this country and how they assimilated. Because I want to understand how did my ancestors coming from Europe become white? We weren't always white. even after that moment that I talked about in the late 1600s, early 1700s, many ethnic groups who came, for instance, the Irish were not always considered white. Eastern Europeans were not always considered white. Italians, um, Jews were not always considered white. So there are different points in history at which each of these ethnic groups, and those are just the ones that I know about. And, I hope you'll do your own research on your particular ethnic groups. There's a process of becoming white, being attached to becoming American, coming to this country and becoming American. So that's what I want to look at today. I can take you on a little imaginative tour of what I think might have happened with my ancestors. So I believe the first ones to come over were on my father's side, and they were Jews, and they were coming from Eastern Europe, Russia. Sometimes I've heard Latvia. I don't know exactly which. Russian Empire had so many different countries or parts to it at different times, and that was always changing. But I do know that the documents that I've seen were in Russian, um, at least the Cyrillic alphabet. I'm pretty sure they're Russian. I know a tiny bit of Russian from college. I believe they're in Russian. Anyway, so that was my great-grandparents. They came to this country. They were Jews. They were fleeing persecution, I'm imagining. During the late 1800s, that was a time of a lot of pogroms, which meant a lot of violence against Jews, a lot of resentment, in addition to a lot of restriction in terms of which professions Jews could be in, where they could live, and a lot of extreme poverty because of that. So that's why my great-grandparents came to this country. I don't know a lot about them except that eventually they settled in Boston. There was a big Eastern European Jewish community in Boston. And I know that eventually my great-grandfather, I believe, became a doctor. I know that my great-grandmother, at least one of them, was a midwife in Russia. I actually have those documents. Another interesting piece of this is that I actually have a name change document. So when my great-grandfather, one of my great-grandfathers, came to this country, he actually changed his last name. And part of that was, I imagine, it was his actual last name was too difficult to pronounce, perhaps, or stood out too much, maybe as being a Jewish name or an Eastern European Jewish name. But that started very early. So that's that process of becoming American, becoming assimilated, fitting in happened very early on. On my other side of my family, again, I don't know a lot. I know only my grandfather's side. So my mother's father came from Norway. So at least I'm a quarter Norwegian. And again, I don't know why they came, but what I've read is that most of the Norwegians who came mainly, a lot to like Minnesota, the Dakotas, that part of the country, many of them came because there was a kind of famine. They were farmers, and something happened with the crops. There was just a famine, not enough work. The population was really growing, and there was not enough room for everybody. I read that some Norwegians were also fleeing religious persecution. I don't know if that was the case with my own ancestors on that side. But I do know that they came to South Dakota, which is where my grandfather settled. I don't know if he was born there or in Norway. Probably my siblings could tell me if you're watching this. But my mother was definitely born and raised in South Dakota, and they were um, farmers at the beginning, I believe. My grandfather. I remember going to a farm as a child and riding a horse for the first time. And I grew up also on stories. My mother, I think I said this in another episode, she did have an awareness of it being Sioux land that she was, that our family and those ancestors of mine were living on. And she had a lot of feelings about that, a lot of guilt, a lot of curiosity, desire to understand that experience as well. Um, and I believe either I think my grandfather at one point taught on the Sioux reservation. I didn't know what a reservation meant. I'm only learning now, like how incredibly brutal that the treatment of Native Americans was from very, very early on in this country. I mean, I know we talk about genocide. I say it almost not casually, but it feels like it was so long ago and disconnected from me, but it's really not disconnected from me. And I think that on that side of the family, these Norwegians were able to come to this country and have land available to them. And again, I think that was through the Homestead Act, I imagine. I can't imagine it wasn't. On land that was stolen from Native Americans, but also in that process of it's not just the stealing of the land, it's also just the slaughter of the original inhabitants, the indigenous people of that land. And of course, coming to this country, so both of those, Russian Jewish on one side, Norwegians. I don't really know my mother's mother. She was kind of a mystery to me. She died when my mother was young, and I never was really clear about her ancestry. Sometimes I heard German, sometimes I heard Irish, sometimes I heard Native American as well. She's really kind of a mystery to me. But what happens, the coming together, I'm just imagining, I'm imagining these ancestors arriving in this country and looking around and saying, how am I going to survive here in this new land? They're fleeing something, looking for something better in this new country. And I'm imagining they're looking around and they're saying, well, who looks like they're successful? And maybe they're looking at who owns houses. Maybe they're looking at who is working in professions that might give them a chance of making something of themselves in this new country. Who are the mayors? Who are the government officials? Who's in Congress? Who's the president? Has the power here when I go to the bank and open a banking account for the first time in this new country? So I'm imagining they see, all these people have something in common, and they start to hear, white. They start to hear about being white. And maybe they're not white yet. Maybe they're Norwegian, maybe they're Jewish, maybe they're Russian. But I'm imagining that pretty soon they start to understand that having white skin means you have power in this new country. And if they're not in completely segregated places, for instance, perhaps in South Dakota, maybe my grandfather, great grandparents, maybe they're looking around and saying, well, we're not Native American. And that would not be a good thing to do because they clearly don't have any kind of power here. They're living in these reservations. In Boston, I'm imagining, maybe my great grandparents are looking around and maybe they are seeing in some neighborhoods Black folks and seeing that the Black folks don't have any power, seeing the poverty, seeing the segregation. They're starting to imbibe from the culture around them that being white means being superior. They're starting to learn that. They're starting to learn how to disconnect from their own cultural heritage and give that up to become white, to become successful, because being American seems to them, I imagine, to mean being white. And so I'm just imagining that process, and that's a new thing for me to imagine in the last 5-10 years. Before that, I grew up on stories of there was more of sort of we were the, particularly Jews, we were the victims. We were fleeing persecution, and this was our refuge in this new country. And we really didn't have anything to do with the intense, discrimination, and it certainly didn't have anything to do with slavery. That had already ended by then. We didn't have the power to make segregation happen. That was so the way it was kind of passed down to me loosely. I mean, through history books, through the little bit I heard growing up in my family from my own imagination of books that I read, was that we were also coming. We were coming to this country for freedom, for to not be killed, oppressed. So how could we be part of the problem of racism in this country? That's really the way I saw it. So I'm imagining it was, looking at it in this different way. We learned, that's how I see it. We learned to become white. We learned to see ourselves as superior, as white people. We learned white supremacy. We learned to let go of a lot of our own cultural heritage. And I want to talk for a minute about that because I'm going to put another book in the comments for you. It's a really great one, Witnessing Whiteness. And she talks about kind of that the loss that many white Americans have, that we don't have, most of us don't have that really deeply rooted sense of an ethnic cultural self. And we may have a sense of, and I definitely relate to this, definitely have this sense of, missing a richness, missing like color and fullness and, something that's particular, that's beautiful, that has a long tradition. And for me, because I was, half Jewish, I really clung to the Jewishness. I really learned everything I could about being Jewish. I learned Hebrew. I got asked my father to if I could learn Hebrew. I sometimes went to synagogue, and that was something I wanted. It was not something that was actually offered to me. My father wasn't religiously Jewish, so just vaguely culturally Jewish, and it was what do you call it? Our home was not a religious household, but I just had this longing for something, something like I said, a tradition, some way to understand myself, that had deep roots, and I think that might be, at least that's what can't say her name, but Witnessing Whiteness, the author of Witnessing Whiteness, says she thinks also that that's a deep kind of loss that many white Americans have. And there's a sense that whiteness, it doesn't fill that. Whiteness seems kind of superficial and empty, hollow. And I think there's, in my family, I remember feeling a lot of, I remember my mother in particular, she would often go and, buy things that from Guatemala or from, that were made by artisans in a country in Africa or something like that. I remember there was a store, I think it was called Pueblo to People, something in Houston. And there was this sense in those things, there were a lot of color, a lot of beauty, a lot of richness. And I can understand why so many of us white people want to appropriate other cultures, because we've given up our own. And so I think, along with that loss, there's also, when I'm confronted by my own whiteness and my own complicity in white supremacy and systemic racism, there's also an impulse for me to want to go to ethnicity or to, being Jewish or something like that, so that I can escape or obscure kind of my identity as a white person, because I don't like it. It doesn't really feed me in a spiritual sense, like a spiritual, cultural, deep rooted sense. The white identity has not been associated with anything really positive. And I think it's important to build that, because, I'm already here, right? I'm already the descendant of Europeans who have disconnected from their own cultures to become white. I've already benefited from that in many, many different ways, as I've talked about in previous episodes. So I have to own that. I have to look at my whiteness. And I think at the same time, one of the things that can help us as white folks to build a positive anti-racist white identity, which I think is extremely important, so that we're owning our whiteness and everything that comes with it, so that we can begin to, dismantle it or step back from it and behave and interact and see and understand in different ways. But I think it could be really helpful to reclaim those deep roots in our, in our ethnic heritages, to have something to help us, to have some strength or some spiritual roots that can sustain us in doing this work. So again, I want to be very clear about this, not to escape whiteness by just saying, well, I'm Jewish, well, I'm whatever I am. This history has nothing to do with me. Not to do that. That's a very, ethnicity is not the same thing as race. And I benefit from my race, which I didn't ask for, but I have benefited from it. I benefit from it. And that's despite whatever ethnicity I might have. So again, to be clear, to focus on, to explore, to own, to understand the white racial identity, and to use exploring my ethnic cultural identities, heritage and traditions as roots to draw from. For instance, in Judaism, there's many beautiful, beautiful teachings that can help. that can help me. There's things about not oppressing a stranger. There's a lot about, this to the time of Pesach, of Passover, of liberation. Um, there's so much to draw from there. If I'm just white, white doesn't. There's nothing to draw on from that. So creating a positive, anti-racist, conscious white identity is very important. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it now. Let me see how I am doing for time. I think I've gone too long, so I'm going to pause here. So let me know how your exploration is going for you. Do you resonate with this idea of kind of cultural ethnic loss, of kind of a longing for something with a tradition, deep roots? Can you imagine a positive white anti-racist identity? What are some of the things that you're able to draw on from your own cultural ethnic heritage? How much do you know about that heritage? Have your parents or grandparents educated you about that? Is there stuff that's been passed down? I look forward to continuing the conversation. Please do comment, share with others, subscribe, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you.